Tonight I better start with a warning. A lot of the content I'm going to show you may be distressing to a lot of people, because tonight I'm going to focus on the horror in Israel for a very good reason, because you've got to know what's really at stake here. We've had civilians there slaughtered and as many as 100 Israelis taken as hostages, many of them women and even children. We will cover it all because this is going to change so much. We'll also give you the latest news, the fate of the hostages, how Israel will strike back. We'll also cover the troubling reaction from Muslim protesters around the world, and even more disturbing reaction from Muslim leaders here. We've even just had police warning Jews to stay away from the Sydney Opera House tonight for fear of pro-Palestinian supporters. This country is not what I grew up in. And also tonight, controversy over the Albanese government's response has been too soft on Islamic extremists too hard on Israel. But also tonight, a devastating new poll for Labor's planned voice to Parliament ahead of the referendum on Saturday. But if you saw Ray Martin's disastrous appearance on the Voice debate on Channel 7 last night, you'll probably understand why it's sinking like a stone. Watch and laugh. And at the end of the show, after all that, I owe it to you, a moment of hope. I'll tell you about this photograph taken in the Hunter Valley on Saturday. So a huge show, but to start with, we need to be very clear about what we're talking about here, because already you're hearing the excuses. You know, Israel's just the same as the Palestinians, yin-yang, Israel causes tit for tat, eye for an eye, circle of violence and all that. We've even had race-baiting Senator Lydia Thorpe play that game. In fact, tweeting, "I stand with Palestine," complete with fake maps, supposedly illustrating Israel's guilt. I stand with Palestine after all this, and not with Israel, the victim of this horror. Lydia Thorpe is a special case. How on earth is she in Parliament? But let's be clear what we're talking about. We have to be with things like that, because so much now is going to change after the surprise invasion of Israel by Palestinian terrorists. There's so much, like this idea that the left, this idea that Labor has had for so long, that Israel's enemies are essentially reasonable. Now, they're really like us, you know. If Israel's just nice enough, there will be peace. And if something bad has happened, obviously Israel's to blame because, you know. Well, let's rip that lie to pieces. I'll show you now what really happened. Now, I can't show you the worst. It's just too horrific for television. And some of you will think I'll still be showing too much. But we must understand, be crystal clear about what happened, because this attack was monstrous. It's unforgivable. And the people making excuses for it, or even cheering it on, are, well, I'm sorry, but they're monsters themselves. Now, this started when the terrorist group Hamas, this actually controls Gaza, which is home to 2 million Palestinians. It fired around 3,000 rockets into Israel and then sent in its terrorists to murder Jewish civilians, men, women, and even children, gunning them down at bus stops or in their cars or outside their homes or in their homes. More than 700 Israelis are dead. In fact, terrorists, some of them flying over in drones, attacked a music festival in Israel, murdering people in their cars and sending hundreds and hundreds of others fleeing, but not before the terrorists killed about 260 of them, just music lovers, including a German tourist whose half-naked and broken body was later paraded through Gaza in the back of a ute. Israeli women there were also kidnapped, like this one, and taken back to Gaza as hostages. Young men as well. And they were beaten on their way to captivity. Meanwhile, other terrorists combed towns and kibbutzes, shooting civilians, including a teenage girl, to the horror of what seems to be her family. And again, I must warn, this is distressing, but you have to know about it. Now, this horror, I'm afraid, is going to continue. Don't treat this story like, oh, that's what happened on the weekend and now counting the cost. Because think of all those hostages that these terrorists took. There's maybe 100 or more, the Israeli government thinks, including women and babies and children. Here's one of those children, by the way, a boy taken back to Gaza, and then mocked for the cameras and hit. Even elderly women were taken as hostages, and some then forced grotesquely to perform with the terrorists who'd taken them as if it's all a big joke. The question is, what will Hamas now do with those hostages? How can Israel rescue them? How many will survive? What's ahead? I mentioned Hamas. It is backed by Iran, an ally of Russia and of China. And the aim of them both, Hamas and Iran, is not peace with Israel at all. It is the destruction of Israel. And when the Hamas leader saw the footage of what his terrorists were doing in Israel, he smiled and he prayed in thanks to his God. Iran's president was also thrilled.
It is a manifestation of resistance and standing against the fake Zionist regime. The Palestinian people, the Palestinian soldiers, all Palestinian groups and the Islamic Ummah should really be congratulated for this victory.
So what now? Israel has promised punishment like never before. It's moving armoured vehicles to the border with Gaza, clearly readying for a land invasion, and has already been bombing buildings in Gaza used by Hamas and its terrorists. But what next? Well, for me, one thing is critical. What next is to listen to this brutality, to heed it, because it speaks. And what it says is that Gaza, a key part of Palestine, is ruled by people who hate Jews and will stop at nothing. These are people who prefer killing to peace and celebrate the kind of barbarities that have shown you and even worse ones that I can't. People being shot, beaten to death. You can see it on video. The bodies of dead men and women being defiled. And until that culture of those people changes, who in the West could now seriously tell Israel to back down, compromise, be reasonable? Be nicer to Hamas. Who can compromise with monsters like that? Joining me from Modin, that's between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, is David Lang. He's an Australian-born. He's worked in oil and high-tech businesses before forming Israeli Cool, Israeli Advocacy, a non-profit defending Israel and fighting anti-Semitism full-time. David, it's great to catch up with you again, but not in these circumstances, I guess. It's now morning in Israel. What did you wake up to today?
Well, thanks for having me, Andrew. I guess the more appropriate question is, did I even fall asleep? And that's something that a lot of us are facing. It's becoming an increasingly hard thing to do. I did eventually fall asleep. I got maybe an hour or so, and I woke up to an almost, I would say, eerie quiet, given the events of the last few days. Broken by the occasional noise of fighter jets, which are obviously going to or from Gaza, where they're performing targeted strikes against Islamic Jihad and Hamas locations. And as for my fellow Israelis in the Gaza periphery, I would say that they were woken up to red alert sirens.
Have you had any fresh news about the hostages?
It's still pretty unclear. Most of what we know about the hostages is based on those videos circulating on social media. We know that there's probably at least 5 of the 100 plus hostages who've been brutally murdered, and including perhaps the kid in the video that you showed in the preamble. As for the fate of the others, there have been reports that Hamas have been aiming for some sort of prisoner swap, kind of like with the Gilad Shalit deal. But I wouldn't want to speculate too much because they're capable of absolutely anything, as we already know. Well,
no doubt Israel's now, I understand there's about 8 battles still going on outside the perimeter of the Gaza Strip. They bulldozed the fence, cut holes in it, what have you, captured checkpoints. So that's still going on. But I guess all Israel's now poised for a wider reaction from the military. What are you expecting?
We're all expecting a full-out war, the sort that we haven't seen in perhaps decades. I mean, because what we saw is the most serious thing we've seen in decades. As I mentioned, we already see a lot of activity with the IAF striking terrorist targets in Gaza. I believe there's been about 1,100 so far, and maybe 500 overnight. And I would like to point out, Andrew, that at least one of those terror targets was a mosque, which the other side like to portray as a war crime on our part, but it was a Hamas asset. And I guess we shouldn't be surprised that these murderous people would cynically use a place of worship to launch attacks against innocent civilians. As you mentioned, Andrew, the IDF have continued to strike within Israel as well. We have those infiltrated the 6 locations within Israel, and they've also struck terrorists that have continually been trying to infiltrate into Israel from Gaza.
It's just incredible. How are Israelis generally reacting? For a start, I would guess thered be a lot of anger that your security agencies would be rated about the best in the world, the most advanced technology. You've always felt quite safe. Everyone, or a lot of people might have watched that Fauda series that was just so incredible and detailed in, how IDF personnel had infiltrated into, Palestinian-held territories. They knew what was going on, but no one saw this coming. I mean, a massive attack, and no one saw it coming.
Yeah. Look, many Israelis, myself included, of course, have questioned how this was even possible for all the reasons you just mentioned. And while it's still not clear how this happened, there is speculation, of course, with everything in this. The speculation is that Hamas might have bluffed us into thinking after the last conflagration that they were not willing to, enter into a war with us. And look, there were many exercises, apparently, some practice exercises occurring, which we may have been aware of. But for whatever reason, the top brass and the intelligence didn't take it seriously, perhaps because of this bluff, as it were. Are we angry? Look, I would not describe the predominant emotion here as anger against our government or against our military or intelligence. It's dwarfed by the overwhelming feeling of grief, shock, and disbelief, quite frankly. And any feelings of anger we have are directed mostly, if not solely, against the murderers, the terrorist murderers that perpetrated these horrible crimes. Now, don't get me wrong, Andrew, there will be a time for recriminations over this huge intelligence failure, but now is absolutely not the time.
I tend to agree with that. I mean, I see some journalists, I've seen some journalists today, being taken aback when Jewish leaders here, a couple of them have likened the scenes, not quite to the Holocaust, but reminiscent of the Holocaust. And I guess that's because they're seeing Jews paraded, mocked, humiliated, killed, slaughtered, to all this celebration and ululation and all that kind of stuff. Is that how you see it as well, or is that likening, that analogy, a little too extreme?
To be perfectly honest, I don't find it too extreme. That's exactly what many of us, myself included, felt, for the very reasons that you mentioned. It really is analogous to the scenes of the Holocaust, where you've seen kids, family members being slaughtered in front of their loved ones, people being abducted and paraded on the streets, embarrassed, humiliated. What other analogy can you really make in that situation? Although there have been other analogies. There's other analogy is the 73 Yom Kippur War, which, by the way, we just commemorated the 50th anniversary of that very recently. And that, of course, was started by the Arab armies on a holy day, which is exactly what happened now. This was not just the Jewish Sabbath, but the Jewish holiday of Simchat Torah. So there was the element of surprise, and also the number of casualties from the Yom Kippur War are very similar to the casualties that we've seen so far, although the casualties so far in this particular war have been higher and are unfortunately expected to climb even higher. just one other thing with the Holocaust.
Yeah, but as soon as you say, it was on a Yom Kippur, it was on a holy day, it's true that the security forces aren't alert on the holiest days. Of course, that is an invitation. Of course, that. But anyway, you're right. This is not the time, and there will be a reckoning. David Lang, thank you so much, and keep safe. Thank you so much. Later, we'll talk about the really, frankly, frightening reaction from our Islamic leaders to what you've just seen. We do have a problem. But first, I need to sketch the big picture here. And joining me is the country's top foreign affairs writer, Greg Sheridan, the Australian newspaper. Greg, I've been looking forward to talking to you, but this attack on Israel by Hamas. Now, Hamas, I think this is should change a lot of perspectives on this. Hamas must have known that something this brutal would totally destroy any chance of peace with Israel for at least another generation, but it didn't care. It went ahead. So why did it do it?
Well, I think you're right, Andrew, and your last interview was very illuminating. I think Hamas, and I argue this in a column tomorrow, consciously created and choreographed Holocaust imagery in its shocking attacks in order to create the maximum trauma in the Jewish mind that is possible. Hamas doesn't want peace. You're absolutely right. It knew it would destroy the chance of peace, but Hamas doesn't want peace. Hamas is absolutely indifferent to the lives and well-being and human rights of Palestinian citizens. Remember, when it first took power, it threw Fatah Palestinians off the tops of buildings and created deadly punishments for Palestinians who were gay and so forth. I think we're in danger of slightly underestimating Hamas's rationality here. I think they want to traumatise Israel and weaken its morale, but also it would seem to me they want Israel to engage in a big ground operation in the south. And there is every chance that when Israel is fully extended doing that, Hezbollah will strike in the north. And they may even have a crazy dream that they can overwhelm and destroy Israel in that final confrontation. And the other point I'd make is obviously this is directed by Iran. It probably destroys the chance of an Israel-Saudi Arabian peace deal, and Iran certainly didn't want that to go ahead because Saudi Arabia is its great rival for influence in the Gulf. So I think it serves Iran's purposes, and it probably serves Hamas's hideous but sort of rational strategic vision as well.
Yes, it's Israel is unlucky in its neighbours. A terrorist group, Hamas, controls Gaza in the south. Another terrorist group, Hezbollah, also funded by Iran, controls quite a bit of Lebanon to the north. I hadn't thought of that pincer movement. It's frightening. But talking about Iran, look, Hezbollah didn't order 3,000 rockets from eBay. Doesn't have a great manufacturing capability in that area. So who is backing this? Is it just Iran? Is it beyond Iran?
Well, I think it is predominantly Iran. It may conceivably have a Russian fingerprint in it, but Russia doesn't have any rockets to spare at the moment. I think it is overwhelmingly Iran. Iran is now the chief state sponsor of terrorism around the world. Iran is a Shiite movement, but it's always been very fond of the Muslim Brotherhood. Some of the early works of the Muslim Brotherhood was translated into Persian by the Ayatollahs themselves, and they've always wanted to exercise leadership in the Sunni world as well as the Shia world. They have really dominated Hamas, and Hamas has been, to some extent, an instrument of Iranian policy. The Wall Street Journal today published a very powerful, definitive piece detailing meetings between Hezbollah and Iran and Hamas in Beirut, planning this very action. Now, as I say, I think it certainly serves Iran's interest to derail the Saudi-Israeli peace process, but also Iran demonstrates its reach. And in a sense, as someone else commented, this is just the war Iran wants to have with Israel, carried out by proxies, carried out on Israeli soil, causing maximum possible human distress to Israel. And as Israel is forced to intervene in Gaza, within a week, I bet the international community is criticising Israel for overreacting, and Israel will again be cast as the villain, even though the scenes that we witnessed and which your last guest was talking about were simply unspeakable. They're just unspeakable. They almost make you ashamed to be a human being.
Now, you mentioned two problems already about an invasion in Gaza. On the other hand, I can't see how Israel's got any other option. It's got those hostages there. Hamas is a master of propaganda. They'll just have videos of them. Come and get them, come and get them. They'll hide them under the tunnels that run all through the place. Israel has no option, or does it, to an invasion. And you're right about, the world looking to blame it. I'm hearing the ABC this morning, restraint, all that kind of stuff. Does Israel have any other option but to invade?
I don't think so, Andrew. So I'm loath, like your previous guest, I'm loath to engage in a great heap of criticism of Israel at the moment, but I think they did make a mistake when they gave Hamas 1,000 terrorists in exchange for one Israeli soldier a few years ago. Whenever you free a hostage that way, Israel's desire never to leave a soldier on the battlefield, it's a wonderful desire. But whenever you engage in bribery of terrorists over a hostage that way, you create a tremendous incentive to take hostages in the future. Now, the United States has just given Iran $6 billion to free a few American hostages. And I think even though this is going to be agonising and, it's simply unimaginable what might happen to those hostages during an Israeli invasion. And I don't want to distress folks who have family in that situation, but I don't think Israel does have any option but to go into Gaza and to destroy the Hamas leadership. I think if they don't do that, then they guarantee that this happens again, and other folks will try it too. I mean, the West Bank extremists will be inspired, and Hezbollah will feel embarrassed that Hamas can do this with far fewer resources than Hezbollah has in the north. So I'd agree with you. I don't think Israel has any alternative but a ground invasion. And indeed, it is massing tanks right now on the Gaza border.
And let's not forget, I think Hezbollah has what, Greg? About, 10,000 rockets pointed at Israel. So my goodness me. Greg Sheridan, thank you so much indeed for your time. After the break, change. Disastrous polling today for The Voice, just 5 days before we vote. And perhaps no wonder that it's still sinking like a stone. If you saw the performance last night of Ray Martin, most amusing. Later in the show, what kind of country is this that there's a protest as we speak against Israel, not Hamas, against Israel in Sydney? And a top Islamic group refuses to condemn the massacre in Israel and the kidnapping of Jews. But first, a switch to Australian politics, because this is a week that could change this country forever, divide us by race, if Australians on Saturday vote for Labor's Voice to Parliament, an Aboriginal-only advisory parliament, cemented forever effectively in our Constitution. Now, the good news is that the latest news poll now shows the yes vote falling to its lowest level yet, just 37%, with the no vote 53%. And if you saw former TV star Ray Martin on Channel 7's Big Debate last night, he's a real yes campaigner, you would understand why. Martin was picked for the debate because the producer said he was Aboriginal. His great-great-grandmother was Aboriginal, and that made him Aboriginal too, apparently. But last night, Ray Martin had no idea what the voice he was barracking for would actually look like.
What is the voice, Ray?
The Voice is an opportunity for first Australians to talk about their problems as they haven't been able to do for 235 years.
And how much will it cost? What will it look like? How many people will be involved?
It's not our problem.
That's ignoring all the Aboriginal bodies we've had for decades and decades and decades. But never mind. That, by the way, is the same Ray Martin who recently abused no voters at a rally. He was invited by the Prime Minister himself at a yes rally. He abused no voters as dinosaurs, or, excuse the language, dickheads, if they didn't know how the voice would actually work. And Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price last night ate him for dinner.
If you vote in this really important election and you vote no because you don't know, well, I'm sorry, you're a dickhead.
Let's be clear about the slogan. You're an intelligent bloke, Ray. The logic behind the slogan, you're an investigative journalist, is quite clear. When people seek answers to their questions about how this whole thing will operate, how people are elected, we don't know. We don't know. We're told it'll come after the vote's taken place. So if you don't know, if you're not clear, evidently the government's not clear as to how this whole thing is supposed to operate, well, that's a red flag to me.
Bang. Joining me is the panel, Michael Kroger, former Victorian Liberal President, Steve Conroy, former Labor Senator and Cabinet Minister. Michael, isn't that the campaign right there? The Yes campaign, arrogant, abusive, Ray Martin, proud of not knowing, exposed as not having a clue about this voice that it claims is the magic bullet.
Well, I'm afraid Ray made a complete fool of himself, and how quickly you can destroy a long-standing career, a distinguished career in Australian journalist by making such a fool of yourself so quickly. But Andrew, with no detail, still dividing the country by race, with no evidence of how it will work to improve the lives of Indigenous Australians where they need it most, backed by the elites who are toxic in this country now, and sprinkled with abuse like dickheads and racists and idiots. No wonder this extreme voice is going to meet a sticky end on Saturday. And let's hope it does, because we do not want to be a country, Andrew, divided by race forever, and that's what Albanese is proposing.
Steve Conroy, I'm certainly not betraying private conversations when I say this, but it's been clear to me looking at you, you're in pain with what's going on, this whole Yes campaign. You have refused actually to say any word of criticism about it. You're a loyal Labor man. But surely now we should be talking about the implication of defeat for Anthony Albanese and preparing a proper response to when it comes, rather than what we've been served up so far. It's all lies and racism, etc., etc.
Well, look, I consider Ray a friend of mine, Ray Martin. I think his contributions the last week or so, born out of his frustrations clearly, but they're unhelpful to the Yes case. They're unhelpful to, he has a platform, he has an opportunity, as do all of the Yes campaigners, to explain how this is going to help close the gap, close all those targets that Kevin Rudd and Tony Abbott and Scott Morrison and Julie Gillard have all been committed to. And the Yes campaign has still struggled to show how the voice is going to impact and improve those outcomes, and I think that's been a struggle. I remain hopeful. I'm not sure I can remain optimistic given the fact that the polls, slight improvement last week, but clearly as we go into this last week, the slide appears to have continued again. But when it comes to Albo's language, he's been very clear. He's been very straightforward with the public. He says he will respect the outcome. He won't legislate if there's a no. He won't pursue it. He won't pretend he's going to do it maybe after the next election. He said, no, that's it. This is our chance. If we don't take the chance, then he won't be trying to sneak it in the back door. So when you say we've got to, talk about Albo's very straightforward about this. I thought his interviews over the weekend, his interviews over the last week have been very consistent.
No, what you've said is right, and, good, he won't sneak it through the back door. But, Michael, my point is this. It is how you read the result, right? If you are going to be out there, like many Labor people have been doing, many Yes campaigners doing, that it's going down because Australia's racist, or because they're slapping away the hand of friendship, or, they're ignorant, or they're dickheads, or something like that. This has to stop. It has to be seen as a reasoned and reasonable response to a proposition to divide us by race. They've got to admit that actually that's a good result for Australia.
Absolutely. Look, Andrew, there have been 44 referenda in this country. The best result ever, where 91% of people voted for the referendum, was the 67 referendum, to recognise Aboriginal Australians in the census and to give the federal parliament some power over Aboriginal legislative policy. That shows how generous Australians are towards Indigenous Australians, right? How much we want to help. The best result ever. I mean, only 7 of the 44 referendums, by the way, have got more than 55%. It got 91. So, you know, to be told by Marcia Langton that we're racists and all these other people that Australians are racist, well, they weren't too racist in 67, nor, as you've pointed out, were they racist when the yes vote was 65%. And so this has been a wonderful way for the hard left in many cases, the extreme left in some cases, like Langton and Noel Pearson, etc., to understand you do not abuse Australians in the way you have by calling us racists when people just want to, you know, understand what it's all about and they think there are better ways. Andrew, there was an African woman, an immigrant on Sky this afternoon, who said she was voting no. Why? Because she wanted to come to Australia where everybody was equal, not like in her country where it was divided. And that's why she was voting no, Andrew.
You know, well, good on her. Stephen, what is remarkable about this turnaround from 2/3 support to nearly 2/3 against, nearly, is this. This is a proposition that's been backed by most of the major churches and religious institutions like the National Imams Council, backed by most big business, I think 2/3 of the top 20, funded enormously by big business and big charity. It's had the Labor Party lockstep behind it, celebrities behind it. I can barely think of one other than Angry Anderson that said no. It has been a remarkable case of where the whole elite Australia, corporate and celebrity and whatever, says, do this, and the public says no. What is the conclusion to draw from that?
Well, I think we have a very, very simple rule in politics. The voters always get it right. And so I think the message, if as the polls suggest, that it's going to lose, there has to be an acceptance, not just across, you know, the Labor Party, but across the whole country, that the voters have, you know, it seems, you know, at this point, going to be overwhelmingly saying no. And the voters always get it right. That's the first, we're a democracy. That's the first pillar. And we've got to accept that. And then there needs to be a discussion about what went wrong. As you say, this is a campaign that started with 66 to 70% support. And the inability to translate that into a win this coming Saturday will be profoundly disappointing to many. But I want to draw a very clear distinction between the Marcia Langtons of this world and the Labor Party and the leadership of the Labor Party. They have not said any of those things. Some of those commentaries from Ray, from Noel Pearson, from Marcia Langton, whether they've been accurately represented or not, but the Labor Party and the leadership and Albo has said no such things. So I don't accept the characterisation, trying to roll them all up into one and say, oh, that's been the message, you know. I don't accept that at all. But overwhelmingly, if the vote goes as it seems, people have to accept Michael's point that there weren't 66% racists a year ago, and they're not 66% racists today. I think that very much needs to be the case, and I don't believe Albo or the leadership of the Labor Party or even the broad membership of the Labor Party has made any such assertions.
I think that's an important point, Stephen, because of course now we've got about more than 40% of Labor members now voting, apparently inclined to vote no, and Labor can't go around saying even 40% of their own members are racist. So I hope your words get heeded. Michael Kroger and Steve Conroy, thank you both so much for your time. But meanwhile, I've got to call out a truly despicable cartoon in the Financial Review a couple of days ago. It was done by David Crowe of Price. Not David Crowe, a fellow No campaigner, Warren Mundine, and opposition leader Peter Dutton. They're all walking past an apparently Nazi standards symbolising Adolf Hitler. Quite clearly, you see the moustache there. With the caption, you know, the standards you walk past, as if those three are all Nazi sympathisers or fellow travellers. That's what the No campaign is. Now, I wrote privately to the editor-in-chief in protest. I don't think I got a satisfactory response. It was private, so I can't tell you what it was. But I have to say, this is beneath the Financial Review. How can something like that, a slander as vicious like that, as undeserved as that, pass for discussion in one of our leading newspapers? What have we come to? that we resolve arguments like this, like that. Unbelievable. Well, after the break, we'll talk to someone about something else that's equally disturbing. We've got that protest I mentioned today already happening right now in Sydney for Palestine against Israel after what you've just seen. And I tell you, how is it that our Islamic leaders have failed this country in such a scary way, refusing to condemn this horror attack, with one imam who's even shared a platform with the Prime Minister actually celebrating? We'll talk about that and how Senator Lydia Thorpe has also cheered Palestinians too, in probably her most disgusting tweet yet, and that's saying a hell of a lot. The reaction of our Islamic leaders to this horror in Israel has been shocking, alarming even. Now in Australia we've had some Muslims celebrate these killings and all that with fireworks, and a sheikh, an imam, the former Director of Public Relations of the Australian National Imams Council, told the crowd that this slaughter was a great victory.
I'm smiling and I'm happy. I'm elated. It's a day of courage.
That's in Lakemba, Sydney. A crowd like that shouting, God is great, about what you've just seen. Now that Imam, Ibrahim Dadoun, actually studied journalism at Griffith University. It's not even a blow-in in that sense. And then he got a master's, can you believe it, a master's degree in human rights, of all things. Human rights at Curtin University. You either wonder what our universities are teaching, or maybe he just skipped the classes about, murder and kidnapping are not good things. And in between, he studied Sharia law at Islamic universities in Sydney, in Turkey and in Malaysia. And this is the kind of guy we've now got preaching and celebrating the murder of Jews, and to the cheers of God is great. And this guy is not some obscure street preacher either. He was a speaker at the same function that the Prime Minister once spoke at as well, but the Prime Minister today wasn't happy.
There's nothing to be celebrated here. This is a tragic loss of life, including innocent civilians cut down in the prime of their life, and people captured and taken into Gaza to be held as hostages. And as I said this morning, there's nothing to be celebrated here.
Unfortunately, it's worse than even this. I've heard now from 3 leading Islamic groups, including the Imams Council itself, which is our highest Islamic authority in Australia. It issued a press release. None of them condemned this, by the way. None of them condemned what happened. It released the press release saying they defended Palestine, the Imams Council. Not a word of criticism of anything I've shown you, not of the murdering of Jewish civilians, not of the kidnapping of even children, not of the slaughter of teenagers. And again you hear the same excuses, the same refusal to explicitly and clearly condemn all that. Instead, it was yet another case, but but look at Israel, same thing, look at Israel, they caused it all, they started it. In fact, minutes ago, we had a pro-Palestinian rally backed by far-left organisations march to the Sydney Opera House to actually support Hamas, the terrorist group responsible for all these crimes.
So to anyone who comes out with an argument that says Hamas is a terrorist organisation, let me tell you that it is internationally recognised that we Palestinians, as Hamas, have a right to resist ethnic cleansing.
They walk our streets. Who led in their families? Joining me is David Adler, head of the Australian Jewish Association. David, your response to what you've just heard?
Andrew, this is shocking. It's sickening. It is enormously concerning. I didn't think in my lifetime I would see in Australia such evil supported by community leaders, and they need also to be very careful legally. It is actually a crime to support a prescribed terrorist organisation. I've had 2 senior politicians today, including someone who you've interviewed a few times, Senator James Patterson, who's a former chair of the Parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee, alert us to that issue. But there's a massive, massive moral issue as well. What they are supporting is the slaughter of innocent people. They're supporting rape, and I've had, within the last half hour, more reports of gang rapes, including rapes of young women next to the dead bodies of their friends. I mean, things that you'd regard as unimaginable horror. We've seen elderly people murdered. There is graphic pictures and videos which you can't show publicly, but I'll describe just one more. I've seen a man who's been shot in the abdomen, likely dying, and one of the Hamas terrorists grabs a garden hoe and tries to behead him using the garden hoe. Now, if anyone is supporting this stuff,
terrible. I
if
won't go
anybody
further,
is not
David.
condemning
it's just too distressing.
It is.
Just
It's
one last
outrageous.
thing, because I'm running out of time, David. Another disturbing thing. New South Police allowed that protest to go from Sydney Town Hall to the Opera House itself, which is going to be putting the flag of Israel on the Opera House sails. So they didn't want that. These protesters went there to have their say. I believe in free speech. They could have had that say somewhere else, because what's happened now is that police have warned Jews to stay away from the Sydney Opera House. In this country, Jews are not safe at the Sydney Opera House. That must really shock you.
We've seen 1 or 2 Jewish people who turned up early who have been taken away by police because they carried an Israeli flag. So it seems that there's only free speech for one side, Andrew. And yes, an email went round to the Jewish community warning us to stay out of the city of Sydney tonight, to stay away from the town hall area, to stay away from the Opera House area, because we would be at risk if we were identified as Jewish in Sydney this evening.
In your own capital city.
Correct.
I mean, in Sydney. I mean, New South Wales. This is incredible. How the police could allow Hamas is a terrorist group prescribed in Australia, is banned in Australia, but New South Wales police allow supporters of Hamas to march from the Sydney Town Hall to the Opera House with all their signs and all that, but Jews supporting Israel, which is a democracy, and it's just suffered a terrorist attack, they're the ones led away. I mean, am I missing something here? Is this madness?
It is madness, and up front in your program, you spoke to a good friend of mine, David Lang, about images of the Holocaust and are there analogies? Well, it's not too much of a stretch. During the Holocaust in Nazi Germany, Jews were assaulted in the street by supporters of Nazism. And frankly, the Islamic extremism that is in Hamas, that's in Hezbollah, that's in Palestinian Islamic Jihad, has a lot in common with Nazism.
And that too, absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. David Adler, thank you so much for your time. After the break, protests by Muslim immigrants around the world cheering the attack on Israel. I'll show you some. But also, I'll give you the ultimate antidote, a reminder to me at least this weekend, last weekend, of what really counts. Around the world, Palestinians have partied after seeing the kind of footage I've been showing you of this civilians being killed, Jewish women and children kidnapped, partied in Britain, partied in New York, partied in Canada, where they call for the destruction of Israel in a protest as well. Joining me from London is commentator, author and TV presenter Esther Kraku. Esther, the reaction from some Muslims in the streets, not all obviously, in London I've seen, in Birmingham, it's been disturbing. What do you make of it all?
Well, this is disturbing but unsurprising. I don't know if you remember last summer the kind of sectarian violence between Muslim and Hindu youths in Leicester, but there have been pockets of minorities in this country that haven't actually integrated or accepted British values. One of those values is not celebrating when innocent people are mass murdered in this awful, awful, catastrophic event. Over 700 people in Israel are dead because of this. And it really does draw into question, you know, actual integration of certain minority communities in this country. When we talk about, you know, multiculturalism, actually you're supposed to be integrating into one culture, which is British culture. And for so long, our politicians have been reluctant to address this. Look, there are also politicians that have stoked certain feelings of, you know, jubilation, given with the current events in Israel. Someone like Jeremy Corbyn comes to mind. He's not actually celebrated it, but he has said that, you know, he finds it tragic, but it's Israel's fault, basically, even though other members, virtually all members of his party, including David Lammy and Wes Streeting, have said that they condemn the attacks wholeheartedly. So, you know, it really is a very tragic situation, but it does draw into question, you know, integration into British life and British culture that we should be taking more seriously.
And yet you've even seen Muslim men in 2 Greek refugee centres waiting to be led into Europe, chanting, "God is great," when they heard of the slaughter of the Jews. Have a look. Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar! Yes, they're coming to Europe.
Yes, and we have to question what values they're bringing with them, and apparently we're racist for doing so. But it is important to address that, because if you're going to let this sort of flood of immigrants into the country, you want to know what values they're bringing with them and how they would react to issues like this.
Well, you certainly do, Esther, and that's not the value I think you want to let through the front door. Esther Kraku, thank you so much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. But one last thing, and after all that, you might find it welcome. When you hear of, you know, the kind of cruelty and suffering that I've been showing you tonight, it seems almost wrong to be happy yourself, you know, to be partying. But in fact, that's what I did on the weekend. You see, as I've got older, I found that one of the secrets to life is to find and celebrate those moments of happiness, to find joy. And how wonderful it was to have done that with my producer, Tara Moroney. Got married on Saturday in the lovely Hunter Valley, married to Matthew Bridges, in a ceremony there that Tara planned with all the typical attention to detail that you see on this show, right down to the last cocktail. It was a ceremony where you could tell there was so much love in the air. And maybe that's because it was an Irish wedding. About 15 relatives even flew in from Ireland. The dance floor was totally packed until midnight. Love is what makes it all worthwhile, isn't it? All my best to Tara and Matt, and to all of you watching now. Good night. Chris Kenny is next.